Hello. So I want to talk about the subject of suffering in relation to books. I mean, we all have an interest in suffering as people, and since we also are all readers, we all have an interest in reading about suffering. And writers also write a lot about suffering, right? There's existential philosophy that talks about suffering and its relationship to purpose or meaning. There's ethics, which talks about when suffering is permissible or not permissible, like when can we cause suffering to others, or when should we prevent suffering from happening to another person. Self-help is a big industry. There's a lot of books published in self-help where it's just somebody providing you a framework to lessen the overall suffering you experience in your personal life. One of my personal favorites is clinical psychology, where they look to diagnose and treat and explain away the nature of suffering. So there's been a lot of books that have been published on the subject of suffering. And I should also add, before we start and get into these books, I'm a nonfiction addict, and so all these books are going to be nonfiction books. So the first book is the Journals of Sylvia Plath, the unabridged Journals of Sylvia Plath. There's this great mixture of these three things that resulted in her book being a really good book on the nature of suffering. She's very introspective, she's very articulate, and she had a not so easy time with life, right? Her life was pretty hard. And as a result, her journals kind of created this really interesting book that explores the nature of suffering from a first-person perspective, because she didn't write this as like a thesis on the nature of suffering. It is just her journal entries, but the consequence is that it's a huge book that explores suffering. And because it's such a huge book, I can't get to everything, but there are at least three ways in which I think are worth mentioning. The first way that the book explores suffering I think is worth mentioning is that there is a psychological oscillation between self-love and self-hatred, or the notion of perfection and self-loathing. There'll be many instances where in the book there'll be her talking about something about her life or her personhood in a very romantic or idealized way, lots of self-love, and then subsequently, sometimes in the same paragraph, sometimes in the next paragraph, sometimes a few pages later, she'll describe the same element or the same piece of her life with words like disgusting or gross. She oscillates between these two. So there's this tension that arises as a result. You could almost make it comparable to the notion of the higher they climb, the harder they fall. This expression that's used when people get really high up on the podium, like if you become one of the world's greatest mathematicians, and then you have a brain bleed and you're losing the ability to do math now because you had a seizure of some sort. Well, that's a hard fall, right? Falling from that height is going to be a much harder fall. And so you can see in the book, she has this oscillation where she goes between the highs and the lows, and it does cause her suffering. Another way that this book explores suffering is existential angst. She struggles a lot with purposelessness, and she often talks about being bored with life, and that therefore causes her to develop a sense of meaninglessness, that she doesn't see the purpose to it all. You can almost imagine the person that Nietzsche describes after the fall of God. There's this archetypal description that he gives of a modern human who doesn't have God to support their foundation of meaning and values. And so they struggle with nihilism and apathy. She embodies that notion, that kind of person that Nietzsche describes, in the way that she's communicating her suffering. You can get the sense that she has some existential angst that she's going through. So that's another way that the book explores suffering. And then the last way that I think is worth mentioning here is the artist's burden. This is kind of a trope that a lot of artists engage in, right? And the idea here is that she mentions herself a few times that the great wellspring for her creative works is suffering. The more suffering she experienced, the more she would increase her creative output. It was a fuel source for her. And so because she also didn't like the normal life, she actually says that a life where you have a big house, a big yard, a white picket fence, and a dog is boring to her. She doesn't like that. But the consequence of not having that normal life is to have a life of some displeasure and suffering, because you're not going to fit into what most people view as ideal, and you'll be a bit of a nonconformist in that sense. You'll be on the outside, you'll be different. And so some suffering will come from that. But, and she says herself that it's a great source of fuel for creativity. So great suffering gives great creativity, but low suffering gives low creativity. And so she thinks that she doesn't say this herself, but it almost seems that she believes on an unconscious level, or maybe she just doesn't explicitly articulate it, that there's an artist's burden she's experiencing, where she uses suffering as a way to create, and that's part of the burden of being an artist. This next book, The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, I've talked about it quite a few times. It's a very, very long book, right? This is a thick book, and the font is really small. It's over 1,000 pages, I believe. But I'm putting it on this list because it also explores suffering in a very unique way. It does talk about melancholy in specific, but melancholy and suffering are going to be interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. One of the ways in which he talks about suffering is that it is a timeless and universal condition, which I thought was really interesting. If you imagine you're looking for someone who's suffering out in the world, you'll probably see like a beggar or a thief, somebody who's starving, somebody who's experiencing depression. You look at these types of people and go, that's suffering. But what he's arguing is that, well, that may be true, they are suffering. It is also the case that suffering is universal and timeless. So a king, whether that king is in the 14th century or the 19th century, will have suffering. I believe he's talking about melancholy, but we'll just say suffering. They will have suffering. A lawyer will have suffering, and a criminal will have suffering. A judge will have suffering. Any social role you can think of, they'll have suffering because it's a universal and timeless condition. It's intrinsic to our nature, and so everyone's going to experience it. Another point that he brings up in the book is that suffering is a consequence of disordered thought or disordered emotion. And this is really easily understood through two case examples. One is you can imagine like young Werther, or like the intense romantic person, where they idealize some particular person, and it's like the object of their affection is super perfect, and they want nothing but to live with that perfect object, right? And the second that object becomes tainted, or I said otherwise, the second that object becomes more realistic, the person who was fantasizing about that perfect object becomes emotionally volatile, depressed. Sometimes they'll even be aggressive towards the object, right? And so the disordered emotion or the unbalanced emotion in that person resulted in them having suffering. And the same thing holds true for reason. So you can imagine somebody who wants to have a epistemically certain foundation for their belief in God, let's say, and they spend thousands of hours going through argumentation theory and logic just to derive something that is epistemically certain for God. If they lose any faith in their own epistemic certainty, the consequence will be like apathism or nihilism, complete self-destruction, right? They go from loving God to like becoming complete and total devils themselves. And so the point being is that both in emotion and reason, you have to be ordered or balanced, he says, because the consequence of being unbalanced, being too much outside of the mean, is complete and utter chaos, or melancholy, as he says. The next book is Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. So this book is actually about he doesn't use the word suffering. I think he uses like words like anxiety and despair and so on and so forth. So I'm going to change all that again to the word suffering. And then there's also something else I should add. In the book, he uses the words infinite and finite. I'm going to change those to spiritual and material because it brings across the same point without having as much confusion. So one of the ways that book explores suffering is this notion of an ultimate sacrifice to be committed to your faith. And faith doesn't necessarily have to mean religious, but the easiest way to explain the book is to use religion. In order to have an absolute commitment to your faith, you need an absolute sacrifice. And he gives the story of like Abraham sacrificing his son to God. And if that relates to an everyday person, you could think of that ultimate sacrifice, because if you do that sacrifice, then you could say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, you're committed to your faith. You could, in your day-to-day life, it would be, let's say, for example, sacrificing friends, sacrificing a job, sacrificing maybe certain sets of hobbies. If those hobbies, jobs, or friends don't mend well with your faith, or they are kind of contradictions towards your faith, then you have to cut them out. You have to get rid of them. You have to destroy them. And that is a kind of suffering. And so in that sense, faith can actually bring suffering. That initial leap of faith can bring suffering. In the same sense of the initial leap of faith causing suffering, well, that is also an isolatory task. He says that faith brings loneliness, or maybe more accurately said, that faith has some kind of loneliness baked into it, because the sacrifices that you're going to make to keep your faith, you won't be able to share with other people. It'll be a subjective experience. So if, for example, you're sacrificing your friends and then 6 months later you make new friends, you can't really communicate the intense emotional expression or feelings that you had when you sacrificed your original friends, right? And if you're contemplating quitting your job to be committed to your faith, well, you can't really, it's hard to communicate the intense feelings of anxiety you have about your future stability. Or if you don't quit your job, then the kind of tension that we will feel as a result of the conflicts between your faith and your job, right? Because then you can't really say you're 100% committed to your faith because you chose some material well-being over your faith. And that's a kind of guilt or tension that you feel as a result of that. You can't really communicate these things. And so when you have this absolute commitment to faith, when you take that initial leap of faith, it'll also come with some intense emotions that you can't share with other people. And so that is itself a kind of loneliness. And the last way that this book explores suffering, or at least the way that I'm going to mention, is that there's a constant battle between what he calls the finite and the infinite being God, the finite being material, or social norms and customs. But I'm going to just say like spiritual and material. If you're someone who is committed to something spiritual, then there will be a set of standards that you're going to have to live by. You'll be pulled towards that spiritual realm, especially if you have this notion that you're living in you're trying to live in a way that the deity that is monitoring you would approve of. And on a day-to-day basis, since you ultimately are a human, there's going to be temptations that pull you away from that spiritual side, whether they're sins, like just various sins that you're going to be tempted to commit, whether you're going to get exposed to beliefs that are heretical towards your religious doctrine, you'll be pulled away from God on a day-to-day basis. And so there's a tension that arises as a result of having faith. And the last book on this list is The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. A lot of people like this book. I thought it was an okay book, but I will add that it is a very unique book that explores suffering. It's unique in the sense that it's like someone took Joseph Campbell and mixed him with Freud. It's very weird how this book is conceptually organized. And yeah, it's not written weird, but the concepts are weird. So the main ideas that I think are worth mentioning as it relates to suffering are that humans are symbolic and animalistic. So like we have a symbolic self and we have an animal self. And I believe he actually borrows some of the notions of infinite and finite. So he thinks the symbolic self is infinite. It doesn't have a sense of finitism about it, whereas the animal self does. So if you think about if you look at a bottle of water, it's very material, and then you could see that there's a finite amount of water there. But if you think about who you could be in the future, right? This is your symbolic self. There doesn't seem to be any limits on that. It seems that in your imagination, you can imagine an infinitely approved self. There's no limits to your imagination. And so the symbolic self, or the imaginary self, the self-reflective self, he kind of interchanges these words, is infinite. And then the animalistic self is finite. And the symbolic self has a self-awareness about its animal nature, and it realizes it's going to die someday. And that awareness of its own mortality causes anxiety, and it causes depression, and it makes us angsty about life. And so he calls it mortality awareness, and it's a source of suffering. How he thinks how we should deal with this, and how healthy adults deal with it, is they imagine themselves as heroes. In the face of complete annihilation, rather than cowering and embracing the totality of your fear, you should develop a cope, a kind of pretending to be a hero, right? So if there's a bear, you don't run from the bear, you pretend you're a hero and you run towards the bear and you try and annihilate it. And all that does for you is makes you feel better about your impending annihilation. You're still going to get annihilated, but at least you're going to feel better about it, right? So he thinks we need a cope, and the cope is the hero journey to deal with our mortality awareness. I should also add that he has an interesting way of conceiving of mental health disorders. So because he has this distinction of animalistic and symbolic self, he thinks, for example, if someone spends too much time only focusing on their animal self, let's say age 15, 16, 17, and 19, you just spend doing nothing, you're not developing any skills, you have no goal-oriented future, your levels of anxiety will increase in proportion to the time passed, because the symbolic self realizes has that mortality awareness, that the amount of time that you're allotted to recognize the infinite of your symbolic self, right? Like to achieve some of those lofty goals, like publishing an original paper in mathematics, or earning $5 million, or starting a business that changes the world, right? The amount of time you have to do that is shrinking, and so your anxiety is increasing in proportion to that. And he thinks that a lot of mental health disorders can be reconceptualized around this notion of mortality awareness. It's kind of interesting. So those are some of the books that I think you could read on the topics of, or on the topic of suffering. I'd be interested to know about books that you have to recommend. I know there's so many out there. Buddhism has a ton of books that explore the nature of suffering. I know there's a lot of books in neuroscience that talk about suffering. I even know that there's some interesting philosophy books that go over the nature of suffering. So maybe I can make another video that explores this subject. I'd be interested to see book recommendations that you have of books that I've never seen on these topics. I really do enjoy reading about suffering. It's a fun topic to read about. And I'd probably read some recommendations that you guys have. But until next time, bye-bye.